All right, welcome to the Week 2 Forum. Last week we learned about some of the constitutional principles that structure American government. This week we have an entire chapter devoted to the idea of federalism, which, as I mentioned in the overview, is kind of a system of negotiated sovereignty in which the federal government enjoys exclusive control over some issues, which we call enumerated powers, and areas in which the state governments enjoy a great deal of control, which we call reserved powers, and issues over which the federal and state governments share power. One issue that comes to mind, why did the framers adopt such a complicated system of government? The answer is that necessity is the mother of invention. In the framers' experience, there were only two broad options: a monarchy, which they had rejected with the Revolutionary War, and a confederation, which they had originally adopted and which was proving to be profoundly dysfunctional. Consequently, they created a hybrid system of government, which provided an effective central government while retaining the states, largely because in 1787 most citizens thought of themselves as New Yorkers, Virginians, and South Carolinians. In other words, Americans didn't exist, and the framers understood that. So federalism as a principle of government can be viewed metaphorically as both a sword and a shield. As a principle, federalism helps to shape the battlefield. In other words, everyone is a federalist when they don't want the federal government to do any particular thing. Okay. The cake metaphor is often useful for understanding how the practice of federalism has evolved over time. Up until the Great Depression, the general approach to federal-state relations reflected this idea of a layer cake of federalism. The federal government effectively had no constitutional authority to intrude into issues that fell within the state's reserved powers. The Great Depression changed all that. Franklin Roosevelt campaigned in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression on the platform of a New Deal, and over the course of the 1930s, more power accrued to the federal government to combat the effects of the Great Depression. So instead of a layer cake, the new metaphor of marble cake, with the federal government increasingly injecting money into the state governments, and again, using its expanded regulatory authority to override the preferences of elected officials of state governments. But primarily, it was a positive relationship. It was basically a way for the federal government to get resources into the states. So as you think about Chapter 3, think about the complexity of operating a government where rules governing the interaction between the federal and state government are subject to change. And then ask yourself, who should be in charge? Should the states do most of the work, knowing that the states have vastly different levels of wealth and resources? Or should the federal government do most of the work, knowing that the direction lies in, that's a possible direction towards authoritarianism? The supplement by my colleagues and friends, Drs. Carolyn Taylor and Steve Housel, raise the important fact that a lot of governing goes on in American government at the state and local level. Okay, the states have a constitutional mandate to look after the health, welfare, and moral education of their citizens. More often than not, when citizens interact with government officials, they're interacting with state and local officials. I used the term tax regime in the overview, so I should probably explain a little bit further what I meant. The term refers again to the mix of taxes that states and local governments use to raise revenue. The problem Oklahoma confronts is that the Oklahoma legislature has created a tax regime that has been systematically incapable of drawing sufficient revenue to fund the government's operations. And as a result, over a 10-year time frame, they have systematically underfunded the state operations. For example, common education and higher education combined comprise about 48% of Oklahoma's annual budget. Some would say that the reason for the budget shortfalls that have occurred over the last few years is the volatility of the price of oil and gas, which has been historically low due to global overproduction. Others would say that the reason is that the legislature chose to create a business-friendly tax regime, which meant cutting the top marginal income tax rates for high-income Oklahomans. And they likewise cut the rate for slant drilling for a particular kind of oil and gas exploration for the folks that are engaging in fracking. on the gross production taxes, in addition to passing significant tax breaks to try and encourage more business activity. Regardless, the price for that has been significant budget shortfalls, and under the state constitution, just about every state has a balanced budget, requirement, which means they have to cut. And they generally have cut things like education, healthcare, and other state agencies. The reason, the teachers walkout from last year highlights the fact that decisions by state governments can have a tremendous impact on people's day-to-day lives. The walkout didn't just affect the teachers, it affected the parents. It impacted the children who returned to class just in time to face state-mandated testing. It affected custodial staff who are even more poorly paid than the teachers. And I can go on. I would also note that the walkout didn't happen overnight. Teachers didn't suddenly wake up on April 2nd last year and decide to protest. It was a culmination of a series of decisions by the state legislature to ignore the pleas of teachers to return funding to the schools, and not just in the form of higher pay, but also funding so that schools could go back to 5-day weeks and repair crumbling buildings. These cuts were choices, and those choices created enormous challenges for teachers, for healthcare workers, for prison guards, and for everyone else who works in the state of Oklahoma. As I mentioned in the overview, local governments are very complicated because there are a number of different varieties of local governments, and local governments' responsibilities vary considerably. For rural communities, county governments play a big role in road construction and maintenance. Municipal governments vary widely in the size of the communities and the way the local governments are organized. Obviously, the municipal government and the resources available to a city like Oklahoma City is very different from a municipal government from a small town like Foyle. Another important part of the fiscal picture for municipal governments is that unlike most other states, cities don't get access to property taxes. They go entirely to the county governments. That leaves cities almost entirely reliant on sales taxes to fund their operations. And anyone that knows anything about economics will tell you that sales taxes are extremely volatile and also extremely regressive. And by regressive, I mean they fall more heavily on poor people. Another important issue addressed in the supplement is Dillon's rule, which was first articulated by John Forrest Dillon, who served as both a state and federal judge. Dillon's rule essentially declares that all federal governmental units below the state level are subordinate to state governments. In Dillon's words, municipal governments owe their origin to and derive their powers and rights wholly from the legislature. It breathes into them the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. As it creates, so it may destroy. If it may destroy, it may abridge and control. So what are the practical consequences of this rule? Effectively, state legislatures can dictate what local governments can and cannot do. To illustrate, a few years ago, energy companies were engaged in hydraulic fracturing within city limits of towns like Stillwater. The people of Stillwater objected and subsequently passed a fracking ban within their city limits. What happened next? Well, the energy industry went to the Oklahoma legislature and persuaded them to preempt Stillwater's ordinance. Okay, so hopefully I've given you some things to think about as you read and study the assigned material, and that will put you in a better position to participate in the forum. As always, if you have any questions, great. The forum is the perfect place to ask questions.